walls of Florence. They were unprotected suburbs outside the defenses. So this new circuit enclosed, it looks like they were fairly conservative. They drew the shortest circuit that they could and still enclose the populated suburbs. And they certainly wanted to enclose San Lorenzo. And also for the first time, a portion of the Oltrarno was enclosed in the 13th century. So now the development across the river was defended. No trace of these walls survived because when they were replaced, the city government sold them off as material. But you can still recognize the course in the streets surrounding the city. And they have names like Via delle Fosse. The fosse is a ditch, but it refers to the moat outside the walls. Now, so the city is prospering thanks to her merchants and manufacturers. But during the 11th and 12th century, even into the 13th century, Florence, like most other cities in northern Italy, was plagued by the activities of a certain social group. That is, the aristocratic family clans or kinship groups, originally based in the countryside, in their rural castles. They were more and more moving into the city in the 11th and 12th century. And they created an astonishing building type. These families, these groups of allied families, sometimes they're allied by blood, sometimes by pact. They tended to create their own territories within the city walls, almost recreating their rural castles within the city. And to defend those urban territories, they built towers. It's hard to imagine what these cities looked like in the 12th century. Here's a reconstruction of Bologna, which is just over the Apennines from Florence, with dozens of these tall towers punctuating the skyline. Now, you're probably going to San Gimignano, a very small city in Tuscany, which is famous for its surviving towers. But if you want to see the real thing, you have to go to Bologna, where two of the towers, actually there's three of them, but this one tower still stands at its full height, 300 feet, 30 stories, built in the 12th century. Somehow it escaped mutilation. I've climbed to the top of it, by the way. There's no elevator. Now, in Florence, there were dozens of these towers by the 13th century, all the black dots, each marking the territory of an aristocratic clan. The Florentines called such a clan a consorteria, people who could sort together. And look at this, some of them are virtually touching. That's because the towers were part of a larger residential complex. They would be joined by houses with an interior courtyard. And often typically the towers had wooden balconies, which were removable in times of conflict. You can tell this because of the potholes in the walls where the wooden balconies used to be. So these towers were ostensibly for defense, because these clans were always, fighting each other, working out vendettas between hostile clans. I mean, murdering people in the streets. Dante talks about this. Finally, in the 14th century, in the 13th century, the merchant class, which was briefly in control of the city, got so fed up with the violence and lawlessness of the aristocratic clans that they ordered all the towers to be lopped off. But they're still there. If you keep your eyes peeled, you can identify many of them. They look tall in context of more modest construction, but they're really lopped off to, I think it was 50 braccia. I don't know what that translates to. But these are the defensive towers, presumably of one family who had its houses in between. And some of them have now been turned into luxury apartments. Yeah, you'll get a nice view of the city. So look up, and you'll see the stumps of these towers all over the central area of Florence. Now, one of the most important phenomena of the 13th century in Italy, and actually for all of Europe, was the foundation of two new monastic orders. Usually often called the mendicant orders because they took vows of poverty and were supposed to live by charity. The first of these was the Franciscan order, founded by a rich young man from Assisi, he was kind of a playboy. But one day he was visiting a ruined church in the countryside, and the crucifix on the altar spoke to him and said, "Francis, rebuild my church." He went back to Assisi, renounced his inheritance by taking off all his clothes in the central square, and became a wandering preacher. Followers were attracted to him. Francis insisted that they own no property. They preached in the streets. And after his death, in 1222, he was, with remarkable rapidity, created a saint by the Catholic Church, canonized in 1228. Francis, it's kind of remarkable that Francis was not tried for heresy. The church considered him a rabble-rouser, but they ultimately realized how useful his followers could be to them, and officially recognized the Franciscan rule, made the Franciscan movement into an institution embraced by the church. The second of these orders was founded by a Spanish monk, Domingo Guzman. The order that he founded is named for him, the Dominicans. By the way, you can always tell them apart. Franciscans wear the brown, rough cloth robe of the poor working man of the 13th century. Dominicans wear black and white robes, and there's a kind of pun going on here. What do you call these dogs? Dalmatians. The Italians called the Dominicans the hounds of God, Dominicani. Dominicani, so black and white dogs. The Dominicans are usually considered the more intellectual of the two orders, and they were especially supposed to combat heresy. The early 13th century was a time of great turmoil in the church, with many dissenting movements, so-called heretics. I mean, the Pope even declared a crusade against Catholics in southern France, whom he considered to be not sufficiently orthodox. So that's what I mean when I say Francis, could have gone either way with Francis. And St. Dominic too was canonized with great speed. During their lifetime, and especially after their deaths, people flocked to these new monastic orders. They joined in droves, and also the orders attracted money, attracted donations. In spite of the Franciscan vow of poverty, the church performed some kind of hocus pocus so that Franciscan monks don't actually own anything, but they still have access to a lot of money. With the result that during the 13th and 14th century, the Franciscans and Dominicans built lavish churches in virtually every city of northern Italy and northern Europe. Every city had its Dominican and its Franciscan church. Because these monks, unlike older monastic orders that followed the 6th century Benedictine rule, which was entailed withdrawing from the life of the world and devoting yourself to prayer and work. These monks were meant to serve urban populations. Instead of living in monasteries way out in the country, they lived in cities and preached to the urban populace. So during the 13th century, Florence got its Dominican church and its Franciscan church. Outside the walls of Florence, as they then were, because I know this is true in the case of the Dominicans, the government didn't want them inside. They were a little suspicious of this new brand of monk. Plus, there was more land available outside the walls. So over here on the west side is the Dominican church. Over here on the east side is the Franciscan church. About as far apart as you can get in the city of Florence, because after all, they were in competition. We'll start with the Dominican church. The Church of Santa Maria Novella, St. Mary the New. Founded, we know, in the middle of the 13th century, 1246. And it took a long time to build. This is the final plan. You can see that it's a basilical church. That is, it has a nave, aisles on either side, a transept, and this is the chapel for the high altar. And notice one way in which it differs from early Christian churches, for example. In addition to the area for the high altar, the main altar, there are subsidiary spaces on either side, and actually there's one here too, chapels. There was an increasing demand among the urban wealthy classes for private burial spaces in these churches, for private family chapels. If you were rich enough, you could be assigned the rights to a chapel if you were willing to pay for its construction and decoration. The plan tells us another important thing about Santa Maria Novella. It is vaulted in the French manner. The Franciscans and Dominicans were international institutions. That means they were the means of transmission of architectural ideas. And the Dominicans were the first to introduce the French mode of building in Florence with vaulted ceilings, the mode that we call Gothic. Here's the side of the church. Another way, we think that what was founded in 1246 was a smallish church that eventually became the transept of the larger church. And just you can tell a lot about the inside by looking at the outside. There are thick buttresses on the outside. Those are the reinforcements for the vaults on the inside. preventing the vaults from pushing themselves apart. So you can identify it as Gothic. The facade is mostly of the 15th century by the famous classical revival architect Leon Battista Alberti, and probably you'll hear about it next time. But I just wanted to point out that there are bits of the 14th century facade which was never completed, which are these wall tombs on the facade of the church with pointed Gothic arches. Another way of accommodating people who wanted to be buried at the Dominican church. If you were rich enough, you could buy one of these tombs. Here's the interior. Now, what's Gothic about it? We tend to base our ideas about Gothic architecture on French examples. And Santa Maria Novella has in common with French Gothic examples the pointed arches, hallmark of Gothic, the ribbed and the ribbed vaulting, for a quadripartite vault. It also has lancet windows with stained glass. But you would never confuse this with a French church. Italians, just as they had their own distinctive brand of Romanesque, Italians never adopted some of the characteristics that we most closely associate with Gothic. The desire for extreme height, for example. Santa Maria Novella is only a 2-story elevation. The bays, the piers, are far apart. The bays are wide compared to the narrow bays of the French Gothic church. The whole church has a feeling of spaciousness and airiness. And by the way, the painting of the voussoirs is authentic. Yeah, that black and white, simulating marble revetment. So I just put in, classic example, Amiens. Italians never embraced the idea of the skeletonization of the wall, eliminating as much mass as possible to replace it with diaphanous stained glass. Yes, there's stained glass at Santa Maria Novella, but compare the clear story level here, which is almost all glass, with the upper story of Santa Maria Novella. More wall than window. Large areas of plain wall, of flat wall left. Why is this? It's not that they couldn't do it. They could vault. It's because Italy had its own traditions. And the most important tradition of church decoration was not stained glass, but painting, fresco painting. So what we see here is a church that was drastically remodeled in the 16th century when all of the paintings on the wall were whitewashed. Do you know what Masaccio's Trinity is? One of the landmark paintings of the Italian Renaissance, the first to use one-point perspective. It was on the wall at Santa Maria Novella in the 15th century, and it was whitewashed over. It's not even recovered till the 20th century. This had to do with reform within the Catholic Church in response to the Protestant Reformation. Fortunately, this is a private family chapel in Santa Maria Novella off the transept. The chapel of the Strozzi family, who in return for burial privileges decorated this chapel. And there are actually Strozzi tombs down here. You would endow, the decoration is almost the least of it. The main thing was to establish an endowment so that a priest would say frequent masses for the souls of your deceased ancestors. That was the important part. But also, you could show off how rich you are by hiring famous artist to decorate the walls of your chapel. And commissioned the famous Strozzi altarpiece. This also has hell on one side and heaven on the other. So we were not intended to see bare walls. We were intended to see narrative, primarily narrative painting on the walls. Across town is the Franciscan Church of the Holy Cross, Santa Croce. A popular St. Francis, you may know, after his death, it was discovered that he had received the stigmata, that is, he had the wounds of the crucifixion on his hands and feet. So the cross is an important symbol to Franciscans. Don't be fooled. The facade is entirely of the 19th century. It's Gothic revival, not Gothic. And, well, I'll just say, the Florentines had an extraordinarily difficult time finishing the facades of their most important churches. And you will see several examples. San Lorenzo by Brunelleschi never got a facade, even though Michelangelo designed one. They just, for some reason or other, they just couldn't bring themselves to commit. So a number of facades, including Santa Croce, were finished in the 19th century. It's very similar to Santa Maria Novella, a large nave with side aisles, but look how many chapels there are. This church wasn't begun until the 1290s, so the demand for private burial spaces within the church is even greater. Each one of these chapels was assigned to a wealthy Florentine family. Here's the interior looking towards the main door. Again, broad bays. The columns are far apart. Only a two-story elevation. None of that soaring height of a French Gothic cathedral. Yes, they have stained glass windows, but once again, we have broad expanses of wall ready to receive paintings. And we know that Santa Croce was completely painted before the Counter-Reformation. Some of the murals have been recovered recently, but mostly it was turned into a kind of memorial church for famous Florentines. These tabernacles are all of the 16th century. For example, I'm sure you will go there and you will see the tomb of Michelangelo, and I think also the tomb of Galileo. All remodelings of the original church. Also, significantly, Santa Croce is not vaulted. It has a timber truss roof, although the timbers are painted. Possibly a concession to Franciscan poverty. They were nominally supposed to be poor, even though they controlled vast amounts of money. Vaulting was expensive, so this is a way of demonstrating their humility. By the way, we know that Santa Maria Novella was probably designed by a couple of Dominican friars. We have no idea who designed Santa Croce. Even though it's such a monumental structure, there's no evidence. Names are sometimes tossed around, but I don't believe any of them. Fortunately, the fresco decoration of the high altar area survives, with the closest Florentines come to dematerialization of the wall with the stained glass windows here. And by the way, two of these chapels were painted by the Florentine painter Giotto, so make sure you take a look, the Bardi and Peruzzi chapels. Off to one side is another private family chapel of the 14th century. And I'm showing this to make a point, which is that the architecture of these buildings cannot be divorced from the fresco decoration. They are an ensemble. We're not meant to see bare walls. In fact, it's demonstrable in this case. For example, this is a representation of David having slain Goliath. He's painted as if he were a sculpture, a statue, set within the three-dimensional space of a niche, which is behind the wall, framed by architectural elements. And down here, this is all fresco. These are illusionistic paintings of niches, spaces behind the wall for storing liturgical objects. And I'll just show you the details. So, you're meant to think that this is a real three-dimensional space framed by architectural elements. Same with David's niche, as if these were marble columns framing the opening in the wall where David stands on the other side. So the painting completes the architecture. It is part of the architectural experience of the building. Now, as I said, Santa Croce, here we are looking towards the high altar. Santa Croce was thoroughly remodeled in the 16th century to meet with the new requirements for Christian worship. One of the great demands of the Protestants in the 16th century was that Mass should be more accessible, shouldn't be hidden from the people. So a very important original element of both Santa Croce and Santa Maria Novella was removed. When you go into the church now, you think, how spacious, how open. You can see the high altar as soon as you walk into the church. But that was not the case before the 16th century. From the second bay of the nave, there was an architectural screen separating the nave, where the ordinary people were, from the choir area, which was reserved for the monks and possibly for people who had family chapels on the other side. And we have a pretty good idea of what it looked like. It was not just, I call it a screen, but it was a structure deep enough to have its own chapels underneath the arches. Sometimes called a rood screen. A rood means a cross, a crucifixion, because typically a large cross would be mounted on the center. So basically, ordinary people could not see what was going on at the high altar. They could hear it, if they could, although it was in Latin, didn't mean much. They could hear the bells ringing for the elevation of the host. They could smell the incense, so they'd know what was going on, but they couldn't participate in the Mass. As I said, all removed in the 16th century. In some places, the rood screen survived, so this gives you some idea of separation between the area for the laity and the area for the monks. I mean, it's a solid structure. And by the way, women were never allowed inside the rood screen, only men on special occasions. Now, the decade of the 1290s was a crucial one in the evolution of the Florentine political system, and also crucial for the initiation of 3 large-scale projects. In the 1290s, the merchant elite, the wealthy businessmen of Florence, finally wrested control of the government once and for all from interference by the aristocratic clans. They set up a republic in which only members of the major trade guilds could participate. The wool guild, the linen guild, and so forth. In 1293, this is more than you want to know, but it's important, they issued something called the Ordinances of Justice, which included a list of all of the knightly families in Florence, knight with a K, and who were thereafter banned from participating in government. No more aristocratic participation in government, only the merchant class who were responsible for the prosperity of the city. One of the first things they did was decide to build yet another circuit of walls, the Ultima Cerchia. The 12th century walls are here. Look at how much they expanded the city. They were not just building defensively to enclose new development outside the walls. They were building for an anticipated future of unlimited growth. Look how much open space they incorporated into the city. Open space that, by the way, was not completely filled in until the 19th century. That's how ambitious the project was. Things kind of went awry when the Black Death killed 40% of the population in the middle of the 14th century. But this is the scale of their ambition and their conviction that Florence would continue to grow. This is a late 15th century view of the city where you can see those open spaces and also the fortifications that surrounded the city. Probably the most expensive project that the government ever undertook, more expensive than the cathedral. Miles and miles of solid wall and city gates. Mostly the walls are gone. The walls north of the river were demolished in the 19th century. You can recognize them on the plan because these are, in their place is the ring road around Florence. They're called the
Viale.
The Viale. Broad boulevards, you know, a la Paris. Parts of the walls survive on the south side of the city, the Oltrarno, so you can walk along the 14th century walls, punctuated by watchtowers. And two of the gates, I believe, survive at their original height. This is also in the Oltrarno, the gate of San Nicolo, because it's near the Church of St. Nicholas. The walls are gone, but the gate still stands with this matriculated gallery and the parapets. You know, the soldiers stand behind there with their bows, with their crossbows, so they can shoot at enemies. And this is the city side of the gate, which is open for reinforcing. What's standing now is only a portion of the defensive